is the reality of combat sports that people don't see outside of it. So why is the UFC so threatened by Sean Strickland being champion? Because the majority of the world will never understand anything outside of the superficial value of the fact that he was neo-Nazi, and the fact that he says these things about women, and the fact that he says these things about immigration, and the fact that he says these things about Muslims. It's just never going to fly. And that is why the UFC is going to work night and day to try to topple him while he is the champion and the undisputed champion of the world right now. But only Allah knows best. All right, so for those of you guys that just listened to that, that was literally me reacting to my last video with Sean Strickland and the UFC upset at the fact that he is champion. Well, now, what you guys are watching at this current moment of time is a 9/11 special that I've wanted to do for this particular day. For one, I think it is rather interesting that on a day like this, a lot of people tend to forget the anniversary of what has happened. Now, granted, we're talking about 22 years now since this has happened, right? We're talking about from 2001 now to 2023. That's 22 some odd years that we're dealing with. And today, I noticed there's not a lot of news coverage on it. Maybe I just didn't turn on the news, or maybe I didn't turn on the right news network or anything like that. I'm sure they're talking about it, but not to the capacity that they've been talking about 9/11 in the past 22 some odd years, right? You're talking about people that make specials, people that make documentaries, and of course, people that are going to mention it in a news clip, but nowadays, it's a little bit minimized from that because we're so far removed from that particular generation. Well, I got to tell you, that generation was very impactful to me in many ways. It was very impactful to Muslims around the world, but also very impactful towards people that are in the armed forces, whether that would be in the United States or whether that would be armed forces in Great Britain or Australia or let's say France, any country that was involved with the war on terror, right? No matter what you believe or think about this particular subject, you have to understand that it has become impactful in the lives of many people around the world. Because after 9/11, what had happened? A war broke out in Afghanistan. They toppled the Taliban, only for the Taliban to come back 20 some odd years later to regain it again with a new generation of people on top of having new equipment that they basically stole from America. So that is literally where we're at. Now, the reason why I wanted to do this video and the reason why I talked about Sean Strickland in the beginning of the video, or rather played a video that is now really going hot at the current moment, probably around maybe 500 some odd views now within less than 24 hours, so probably growing from there. I wanted to talk about how me and Sean Strickland relate to having a radical past. I thought this is very important to bring out, and that is the reason why I brought out the audio speaking about Sean Strickland in ways that, well, people are just not going to accept the change that he has had going on. Becoming a neo-Nazi at a young age is going to follow you for a very long time in your life. Now, I want to disclose a couple of things, okay? First of all, I'm going to tell you a story, but I need you to understand that some of this story is classified and I can't give you full details about the particular subject, but I can give you general, details to try to convey this story and how it relates to Sean Strickland and I having a radical past. Well, after 9/11, let's kick it off in the 5-minute mark of this video so that this way we can give you guys a proper timestamp. But I want you to understand that this story obviously dates back to 2001. So, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In 2001, when 9/11 happened, okay, I was living in New Jersey, and I saw the towers fall. I remember at the time, I was moving from one town to another, right? I think at the time, I was living in Union, New Jersey. And that's when I first found out about 9/11, obviously, the terrorist attacks that happened that day. And in the classroom, I remember the teachers were playing the video, or I'm sorry, the live news clip or the news coverage of what was going on. And nobody really knew or understood what was happening. No one knew what was going to happen with the towers. Nobody knew what was going to happen with, let's say, the people that were in the plane. Everything was just up in the air, and nobody really knew. Right now, in the West Coast, at this particular time, on 9/11 of 2023, it is 8:13 in the morning. So somewhere right around this time in the East Coast is when all of this started happening, and I remember it vividly. So ever since that day, it shook and changed the world and how they view each other, how they view Islam, how they view laws in terms of, I guess, how do I say this, a breaching of, let's say, privacy amongst citizens, and also due process. It really tested America's due process system in terms of fairness and justice, right? Those are the things that brought about 9/11. What also brought about 9/11, you have to understand, is that it brought out radical elements from both sides of the world, the Western world and the Islamic world. For one, the Islamic world for a long time has felt that Israel has been a big supporter of America and Great Britain, and therefore has become somewhat of a proxy to the oppression that the Palestinians have experienced in the Gaza and in their particular region, where there is a conflict and divide amongst the Jewish community and the Islamic community, and maybe even somewhere in the mix, the Christian community of Palestine and Israel. So these are some of the war cries and the complaints of people in Al-Qaeda, but not just Al-Qaeda, normal people in the West, in the Muslim world, that in reality don't really have any quarrel towards the West or America or Britain, but rightfully so has somewhat of a quarrel against Israel. So this is the reality of the war on terror and the base foundation of its story in for you to understand what's going on. So after 9/11, you hear a lot of stories of people that have went out and joined the military. Well, I'm here to reveal to you that I was one of those people. I went and joined the U.S. Marines right after, a couple of years after 9/11. And after joining, to be honest with you, I was very gung-ho about the whole experience. I loved it. I loved living a life of adventure. I loved going out there, challenging my body to the limits. I still do. But obviously the military was a different way of expressing that, a different way of expressing challenges to your body in terms of physical and mental obstacles that you have to go through. And I loved every minute of it. So fast forward to a couple of years later, I started delving into Islam. And as soon as I started delving into Islam, let me just say that this is where I really started to become a Sean Strickland. And what do I mean by that? Well, I don't want to say it out loud because of different reasons. Because like I said, I have a lot of classified information that I just don't want to say out loud. But at the same time, I will say this. I can relate to Sean Strickland's radical past. Why? Because let's talk about that. When you fight for one side or the other, okay, you got to understand that you're going to do violent things and you're going to be motivated to do violent things. There's no way around that. Why is that? Because you were told that a certain side of people are no good and you generalize them into this one bubble. And because of that, you start growing hatred, you start growing resentment, and then on top of that, you never want to get to know anybody outside of your own community. Now, here's the thing. At this current moment of stage right now, where I can actually relate to Sean Strickland of being, let's say, a former neo-Nazi, and obviously I'm not a former neo-Nazi by any stretch of the imagination, right? But let's just say, again, I'm going to keep emphasizing this just so you can understand where I'm trying to go with this story. I know what Sean Strickland had gone through. That type of world will offer you a sense of brotherhood, a sense of belonging, also a sense of feeling empowered. Because that's one of the things that you have to understand that deals with this whole situation. And by the way, after I talk about this, I'm literally going to go into what happens after you start winning in life. Do you become more radical? Do you become less radical? How does it pertain to each personality and how they respond to these positive and negative life changes that goes on with them? For one, you got to understand, at the time, there was a part of me that was very disgruntled by the military, and I'm not going to tell you why. There was a part of me that was disgruntled, like anybody else, with the government because this war on terror stuff just wasn't adding up. And crazy enough, I was just watching, after finishing watching Top Boy on Netflix, out of nowhere, you know how they have this autoplay that they have going on, where if, let's say, you fall asleep and you get done watching your Netflix show, another one pops up. Well, out of nowhere, what popped up was Matt Damon's movie, The Green Zone, where he plays, I believe, a chief master sergeant of some sort in the army, where he was leading a platoon of men looking for WMDs. And this was during 2003 Iraq, when, let's say, there was a lot of controversy of people saying, well, there was no WMDs and they couldn't find any WMDs. So basically, you're fighting under the pretense of a lie that, well, has cost the lives of many people on both sides of the fence. And that's the reality of it, okay? It created a lot of people into terrorists that normally would have been upstanding citizens in Iraq or anywhere else in the world that they lived at. But the fact that they had to go out and experience this war and this tragedy, it radicalized a lot of people. On the American side, a lot of American boys and a lot of British troops were getting killed, and it only propelled a recruiting tool for many people to come and join and perhaps maybe avenge the loss of their friend. But who are you avenging the loss to? A people that is responsible for one particular side? Or are you going to look for the specific killer in the sea of many people that are in a war zone that you really don't have a targeted effort to go on? Well, that's the unfortunate reality of the war on terror. It was just a fog of lies, lies after lies. Okay, so one of the things you got to understand is that in this world, one of the things that I learned that really, how do I say this, de-radicalized me in any stretch of the imagination that you could think of. There are no good guys or bad guys. That's one of the things you got to understand that really de-radicalized me from all these different ideologies or picking one side over the other or this and that. I realized that the majority of people, okay, have a spectrum of good and bad within them. I remember one of the hadiths that had been mentioned that is very popular out there. If you guys don't know what a hadith is for my non-Muslim audience, a hadith is basically a written document of the Prophet Muhammad's life, peace be upon him, and all the things that he had seen and all the advice that he had given to people. So basically, it's sort of like a second hand guide to the Quran, or the explanation of the Quran through the life of the Prophet's documented written life, and also the things that he says in terms of interpreting what is in the Quran, or how you should look at it and how you should interpret it for future references. So one of the things that was said in the Hadith, he mentioned something to the effect of, there was a prostitute that was granted heaven after she had died because during her life she went and fed a homeless cat. Okay, and by the way, this is a prostitute, right? So we all have this aspect of, yes, you know, these hoes, they're going to go to hell and they're going to burn and this and that. Yes, this is true for the most part, because if you live a life of a believer and as a Muslim and as a good person, you understand that there's going to be consequences in the end, especially if you believe in the afterlife the way that we believe that in Islam and in other religions. So, because of that, you got to understand, there's no right or wrong in a person. There is only complexities that you're going to find amongst a lot of things, just like the United States and its allies in the war on terror. They love to say that they were the good guys, they were the beacon of good for the Middle East, they were going to bring democracy because they felt that democracy was the only way to somehow negotiate all these chaos that is impending in Iraq at the time. Well, the problem is, with that came a lot of bad stuff. There's a lot of guys in the U.S. military that have committed war crimes, that have hurt children, that have hurt old men, that have shot innocent civilians that had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda or a Daesh or the Islamic State or anything like that. So, how do you cope with that? How do you cope with dealing with death, dealing with destruction, and then having PTSD? How do you deal with that? The problem is, you don't deal with it. You're either going to suffer from it, or you're either going to have a stoic attitude about it. Now, on the Muslim side, the way that the Muslims view it, and the way that I believe anybody who has ever had to deal with death, or perhaps maybe an accidental death, let's say maybe you were in a situation where you had to defend yourself, right? Somebody came to your house in a home invasion. You didn't want to kill the guy, but you're strapped up, he's strapped up, you pull up, he pulls up, and guess what? You know, the dumping starts happening, okay? And then next thing you know, he gets laid out. You didn't want that to happen, but it was your only choice. So now you got a problem in your mind. You got a problem in your state of dealing with these hardships. Now you got nightmares. Now you're dealing with, let's say, a vast number of neurological issues. You hear a sound, all of a sudden you twitch in a different way. You see somebody that looks sort of odd and weird, that reminds you of something that has dealt with in your past in terms of a highly traumatic, violent situations, and now you're triggered. Now you get angry easily. Now you have relationship problems because of that. Now you have to take pills because the VA is asking you to do so, and your doctors are prescribing you all these things because a pharmaceutical company thought that it was a good idea and didn't really think of the long-term consequences. So how do you deal with that as a believer, as a true believer of God? Well, the only way that you can really deal with that is understand one thing. You're not the one who killed those people. You're not the one that hurt those people. You're not. That's a shocking thing for a lot of people to hear if you're the one that did it. But the problem is, you have to understand that everything that has happened from here on and before, Allah has already written. So, because of that, you have to understand that, yes, your actions, you are ultimately responsible for. But at the same time, like what I said about Sean Strickland in the last video, I mentioned that Sean Strickland was never loved growing up, and he never chose to have the parents that he did. He never chose to have the dad that he was born to have, or the parent that he was given by God. I mean, look, he didn't choose any of that. It was a very traumatic life that he had to deal with that eventually led him into the neo-Nazi groups. And by the way, unfortunately, after the military, those are some things that I could totally relate to. You guys remember Andrew Chaudhry from England? This guy, a lot of people say that he was highly responsible for bringing a lot of British Muslims and a lot of British Muslim converts into the Taliban or ISIS during the, Iraq and Syria Civil War era days, which was not too long ago, like 10 years ago or something to that effect. Right? They say that he was responsible for all that. Now, this guy was somebody that, let's say, how do I say this? I mean, let's not go there. I can't speak on that. What I will say, though, is that, yeah, you know, England, from one of the things that I've noticed since we're going to talk about Andrew Chaudhry, there's a lot of radicalization that has gone on in England over the years because of the war on terror, right? It created the likes of Tommy Robinson, but it also created the likes of Maajid Nawaz, who, by the way, Maajid Nawaz, interestingly enough, I want to tell you about this guy. This guy was a former Islamist in England during the time of when neo-Nazis were running roughshod in the streets of England. This was at the time when he got into street fights in England and whatnot, right? He had, I think he was in a situation where one guy died in a street fight or this and that. And then he went to Egypt, got locked up for inciting terrorism because he was part of like some sort of Islamic group that was banned in Egypt, and he got locked up there only for Amnesty International to come and save him. Now, why is that significant? I'm going to tell you why. Because Maajid Nawaz was a hardcore radical, okay, to the point where he hated the West, he hated Israel, and all those things that I had mentioned earlier in the video about the sentiments that the Muslim world has for Israel. Okay, this is very important to understand. Okay, so Amnesty International, this liberal organization, came in there and tried to help him. And by the way, how weirdly enough, the liberals now are trying to cancel Maajid Nawaz because years later, after Maajid Nawaz was an Islamist, he became somewhat of a reformist, and then he became a think tank for anti-radical ideas in how to reach out to youths that have been radicalized and things of that nature. You got to remember, this guy is an expert. Not only was he an Islamist, not only was he locked up as one, but as an activist, as an Islamic activist in England, he was fighting neo-Nazis who were British armed forces members that fought in Northern Ireland. So I thought that's very interesting to bring up in this particular subject, because you look at his life now, he's totally turned around. The guy became an advisor to George Bush and Tony Blair in the war on terror era. Okay, so Maajid Nawaz was a changed man because of the fact that he had these people that he didn't think that would ever help him come out and help him. Now that right there, you don't have to agree with that politically. You don't have to abide by that. You don't have to have the same ethos or the same social contract. But one thing that you can really take away from this Sean Strickland story, and in this particular day of 9/11, as we remember those tragic times, is that if I can change, you can change, and we all can change. And I know that sounds like a cheesy Rocky line, but in the world that we live in right now, we need a little bit of those 1980s cheesiness, okay, to wash away all these different degeneracies that's going on in society today. And then on top of that, just the senseless violence that is going on constantly on a daily basis. And you know what? As a Muslim, I think it's fair to say that these are all the signs of the end times coming.